Hi, and thank you for joining. Today I'm going to be sharing with y'all 3 of our family's favorite soups. These aren't soups that were developed for this recipe or anything like that. These are actual soups that I cook and we eat on a regular basis. I'll put the written out recipes in the description box below, so be sure and check that out. And also, my mom is making a video to go along with this one on her channel, Rambling Rose Farmhouse. She's also doing 3 soups, so I'll link to her video. You can get 6 possibly brand new soup recipes for your family. Be sure and check her video out too. So the first thing I'm going to do is start off by making some bone broth. It's definitely better to do your soup with bone broth. You can use just water if you don't have bone broth. I do just water plenty of times when I haven't planned far enough ahead, but bone broth is preferable. And today I'm using these soup shanks from our beef that we got processed. And we're gonna just fill up the Instant Pot with water after you put your bones in. You don't have to fill it up all the way, but I typically do fill it to the max when I'm making bone broth, just because I like getting the most I possibly can. So I'm gonna fill it up with water, and then I'm gonna add in some apple cider vinegar, just a couple of tablespoons. You don't taste it, but it's supposed to help pull all the minerals out of the bones. So I added into mine. And then I'm gonna turn the Instant Pot on high pressure for 4 hours. You can do less. 4 hours is the maximum time the Instant Pot will go, so I just do it for 4 hours. But I've done it for 2 hours. I've done it where I've done it for 4 hours and then turned it on again for another 4 hours. So it's very flexible. So the first soup is Pizzeria soup, or sometimes we just call it pizza soup. It's probably our family's favorite out of the 3 soups. It's just super delicious. And also, if you have your ground meat already, like meatballs made or ground meat cooked, it's super quick to pull together. I'm doing meatballs today. Sometimes I just cook the ground meat in the skillet without making meatballs, and it works good either way. We all prefer the meatballs, and it's easier to make sure, like if you have little kids, it's easier to make sure that everybody gets some meat. So I didn't even add anything to the meat this time. I just did straight ground meat, made meatballs out of it. I did put them kind of too close together in the skillet, in the pot there, so I had to flip them all with a fork so they didn't get all torn apart with a spoon. But it worked out. I prefer to bake meatballs. That's my favorite way to cook meatballs, is to put them on a pan and bake them in the oven. It's no mess, it's super easy, they all get cooked, and it's totally hands-off. That's my favorite way to do meatballs. But this is about a pound of ground meat is about what you want to do. You could use more or less, it's just your preference, but I do a pound of ground meat. So the next thing you're going to do is take out your blender. Definitely you're going to want to have a pretty high-powered blender for this. I use my Vitamix. It's the only blender I've ever had, so I can't compare it to others, but I love my Vitamix. It blends up stuff to where you can't even tell what it is. So you want to pour in a couple of cups of your bone broth, and trust me on this, just trust the process. I know you're going to turn your nose up and say that's disgusting, but just trust me. You're going to add a cup of okra to your blender, frozen okra, and blend it up to smithereens until you can't see any green bits in it. And it's going to make your soup so thick and nourishing. Okra is very nourishing for like your stomach and things, but you won't taste it. I promise you cannot taste it. And once it's all cooked in, it's not slimy, it's not disgusting. It's really good, and you cannot tell it's there. No one knows that that's in my soup. So you just blend it all the way up as fine as you can get it to go until you can't see any little bits of okra in there. And then you just pour it on in. And right now, it doesn't look very appetizing, but I assure you it is going to be so delicious. Don't let the okra turn you off of this soup. It's really, really, really good. So next, I'm gonna just add in the rest of that quart of bone broth. And then you're gonna wanna do 2 cans of spaghetti sauce. And 2 cans of tomato sauce. Now I am using organic spaghetti sauce and tomato sauce. I do try to use organic of the things that are on the Dirty Dozen. Tomatoes are actually no longer on the Dirty Dozen, but they were. I'm not sure how they got kicked off of it, but they were on the Dirty Dozen. So I do try to do my tomato products as organic when I can. And then 2 to 3 teaspoons of Italian seasoning. It does take a bit of stirring to get the sauce all combined with the okra, because at this point, yeah, the okra is kind of slimy, but as it cooks, that slime will go away. And if you just keep on stirring it, it'll eventually incorporate in. Kind of an up and down motion like that helps it to get all stirred in. So you're gonna add a 6-ounce bag of pepperonis. And anytime I pull out pepperonis at my house, there are little hands reaching for them, begging for them. I probably only ended with about 3/4 of a bag of pepperonis by the time everybody finished begging for them. But I typically cut them in fourths just because our kids are small. You could cut them in half if you would prefer that. It would definitely be quicker. But I do fourths because of our kids being so small. It's easier for them to eat when it's in the soup. And then optional is black olives, sauteed onions and peppers. Those are our favorite garnishes. Oh, I also love sauteed mushrooms in it. Nobody else in my family likes the mushrooms, so I sometimes will saute some up just to put in my bowl. Everyone likes black olives, so I go ahead and put black olives in it. And then the sauteed onions and peppers, they usually can't really, it kind of blends in, so you can taste them if you enjoy them, but if you don't enjoy them, they're not like super prominent in the soup. But I didn't do them this time. I just did the black olives because everyone loves the black olives, as you can tell from the multitude of begging going around here. And this is what it looks like once you get everything added to it. You can tell it does look like it still has a little bit of that okra sliminess to it, but I promise that will cook out. To give it a nice creaminess, you're gonna add 1 to 2 cups of coconut milk. That's what I use. I started out with coconut milk when we were having a lot of dairy problems at our house. If you didn't have dairy problems, you could use something like heavy cream if you wanted, but I typically do coconut milk just because we still have it, we still use it, and everybody likes it. And I don't know how some people do it because I know that there are some people who don't taste their food while they're cooking, which I find insane. I am a taste along the way person because Sometimes your seasonings need to be adjusted, especially if you're doing a new recipe because you don't necessarily like the way other people have seasoned it. So I taste all along the way when I'm cooking, and I added about a fourth a teaspoon of Tony's seasoning, Tony's Cajun seasoning. You could just do salt if you wanted, but I like the extra flavor that the Tony gives, and it also has salt, so it increases that saltiness. And then a little bit more Italian seasoning to taste. So after you get everything mixed in, definitely taste your soup and add in any extra seasonings you might want. But as you can tell here, the sliminess is completely gone. Like it's been cooking for a while and it's not slimy. You would never look at that and go, oh my goodness, that's full of okra. We love garnishing with Parmesan cheese. Now, don't tar and feather me. This is the canned Parmesan cheese, but you could certainly use fresh Parmesan if you had it. So this soup is my personal favorite soup, probably of all time. It's sausage and kale soup. So I'm starting out by seasoning my meat for quote unquote Italian sausage. It's not actually Italian sausage because it's beef, but I am seasoning it up for Italian sausage. I'm doing 4 pounds of meat. I will put probably about half of it in my soup just because we like extra meat. All of the kids mainly eat just the meat and potatoes. So I try to do extra meat and potatoes because that's all they'll eat out of the soup. They don't eat the kale. So I do a little extra meat and potatoes in my recipe. This is for 1 pound of meat. So in the video, you'll see me doing extra, lots of it, because I'm doing a 4 times recipe. So to 1 pound of ground pork, you're gonna add 1 teaspoon of salt, which I just did 4 teaspoons of salt. You're gonna do a half a teaspoon of pepper or less, depending on what your tolerance is to spiciness. 2 teaspoons of onion powder and 2 teaspoons of garlic powder and 2 teaspoons of paprika. Now I did some basil and thyme from our garden that I had chopped up in this food chopper. I added that to it. I don't typically do that, but it was really, really yummy. I definitely will add it again. A tablespoon of dried parsley, and I did probably a teaspoon of the basil and thyme in there. And then a tablespoon of red wine vinegar, but I didn't have red wine vinegar, so I did white wine vinegar, and it tasted fine. Mix that all up really good. It's really hard to mix all those dry seasonings with meat, so you really have to get your hands up in there and squeeze it all together and get it all mixed in really well, or else you'll have huge clumps of seasoning in your meat. Once again, my trusty Le Creuset pot. I got this as a wedding gift, and it has been probably the most used wedding gift of any gift I got. I use it at least 5 days a week. It's constantly on my stove. I'm making meatballs again for this soup. I usually don't do meatballs, but we loved them so much. I just made the meat into meatballs. It really, like I said, it's really easy to make sure everybody gets enough meat in their soup. And while the meatballs are cooking, I went ahead and peeled up my potatoes. Like I said, I do a lot of extra potatoes in mine. Typically, you would do probably 6 to 7 potatoes. I did about 9 potatoes in mine, just because everyone loves the potatoes and the meat out of this soup. These meatballs that have the Italian sausage seasonings in them are so yummy, and it smells so good while it's cooking. So to those meatballs, I am going to add 1.5 quarts of bone broth. And then chop your potatoes and put them in there to get them cooking. And As you can see, with all those extra potatoes, my pot is quite full. I tend to fill up my pot no matter what I'm making. And then you're gonna wanna cut and add 1 whole onion. I cut mine as fine as I can with a knife just because my kids will complain if it's larger. You could always saute these ahead of time if you wanted to, but I find that they cook down nicely in the soup and I don't feel the need to saute them. And then you want to do 6 cloves of minced garlic. If you're doing a smaller pot of soup, definitely start with less, maybe even around 2, just so you don't get it way too sharp and garlicky. Now this garlic press is one that I've had for years, and my mom had one for years when I was growing up, so knew I had to have one when I was married. This thing is from Pampered Chef. It is one of the handiest kitchen gadgets that you could probably ever have. It just minces that garlic so perfectly, and you don't have to sit there and chop tiny little pieces of garlic. I love this tool. If somehow I lost mine, I would be buying another one as soon as I could find someone who sold Pampered Chef. So that's my non-affiliated plug for this garlic mince. I may look and see if I can find one on like Amazon and link for y'all in the description below if I can find one that looks comparable. And then I'm gonna add a bell pepper. This is actually freeze-dried bell pepper, but I'm adding about 1 bell pepper's worth of freeze-dried bell pepper to the soup. And once you stir that around, I am gonna put some Tony's in it. That's the Tony's that I was talking about earlier. Tony's, onion powder, and garlic powder go into everything that we cook. I don't know what I would do without those 3 things. Food would be so disgusting and bland. So I do about 2 teaspoons of onion powder, 2 teaspoons of garlic powder, and Tony's are salt to taste. I start with about 1/4 to 1/2 teaspoon. Start lower because you can add more, but once it's in there, you're gonna have a really hard time toning it down if you get too much. And there's the rest of that basil and thyme that I had chopped up. I would say probably about another teaspoon or 2 of that. And then 1 bunch of kale. I do the whole bunch of kale. If you are not like hugely into the kale, you could do a half a bunch, but my husband and I love the kale. Like it's probably my favorite part of the sausage and kale soup actually. So when I'm scooping my bowl, I try to scoop as much kale as I can, especially because the kids don't want it in their soup. So you could do a half bunch if you want. We do a whole bunch. And this is kale actually that I order from Azure. It's organic also because kale is on the Dirty Dozen list. So I order it. It comes in a big bag. I get the 3 bunch bag. So it comes in a big bag with 3 bunches. And as soon as I get it, I put it in my freezer just exactly the way it comes. I don't do anything special to it. I throw it in the freezer. And then when I want to make this sausage and kale soup, I have a bunch of kale in the freezer that I can just go grab and chop up. I am attempting to grow myself some kale this year in my garden, so we'll see how that goes. But this from Azure is what I have used thus far, and it's always very good. You don't have to put the stems in there. I know a lot of people don't like the stems. I really like the texture of the stems in there in the soup, so I leave it in there. I leave them in and put them in the soup just to give it that extra texture. This soup also has the creaminess from coconut milk. You do 1 to 2 cups to taste. I usually use a whole can. That was a half a can left over from the last soup I made. And then I am gonna open another half can and put it in there. You could use heavy cream if you wanted to. That would work just fine. But it just adds such a delicious creaminess to the soup. If you taste it before and after you put it in, there's a noticeable difference. It's a lot better, a lot tastier with the added creaminess. And there I go. Always taste your soup because you can add more seasons if you need, more salt. You never, you won't know what it needs unless you taste it. And probably a lot of people who are accused of not being good cooks just don't taste the food when they're cooking it and adjust it as needed. This needed more salt, so it's easy to adjust as you go and salt it, season it to taste. This is more Tony's that I'm adding in here. And I also like the herbs. I don't typically do essential oils internally. This soup is kind of the only time I really ever do anymore. But the oils just really give it a nice, strong flavor of the herbs. You'd have to put a ton of the herbs to get that much flavor. I typically do 1 drop of basil, 1 drop of thyme, 1 drop of rosemary, and 1 drop of oregano. If I had all of those fresh herbs, I would probably blend them together really finely and put them in, but I didn't have them, so that's what I do for the essential oils. But definitely make sure you're using high quality essential oils, not like perfume oils or anything like that. I'm not going to get into the essential oil thing. It's not something I typically do, but for this soup, I do use the essential oils. And tasting it just to make sure after those additions that it doesn't need any seasonings or anything else. Make sure it's good. Always taste your food when you're cooking. And this is what the kids' bowls look like. As you can tell, they really just want meat and potatoes, and the little one doesn't eat. She has a very small appetite. And then compared to my bowl, I try to fish out as much kale as I can. It's one of our favorite soups also. They'll tell you they love it. So the next soup I'm making is a red bean soup. I personally am not a fan of beans really at all. I'm not a bean fan. Eric, on the other hand, loves beans. He would eat beans every other day probably if he had the option. But this red bean soup, for some reason to me, doesn't have the same, maybe it's the mouthfeel, I don't know, but it doesn't give the same vibe to me that beans do. I love this soup. So I'm starting off by soaking my red beans, 1 pound of red beans, and I soaked them for about 6 hours. I typically soak them overnight, but I didn't get them on in time. I forgot about them, so I soaked them during the day for about 6 hours, drained them off, and they cooked up just fine. It actually was the first time I had not soaked them overnight, but there was no noticeable difference. They cooked good, they cooked quickly, and I had to make some more bone broth, so I'm straining that into my pot with my beans to get them cooking. So you're going to want 1 pound of dried beans that have been soaked overnight or at least 6 hours, and 1 quart of bone broth. I will go ahead usually and turn that on and get it cooking while I'm adding all the other things and the seasonings to the soup, just because beans take a long time to cook, so it gets them going quickly. So I usually will put in about a teaspoon of Tony's, 2 teaspoons of onion powder, and 2 teaspoons of garlic powder right off the bat to get the really good flavor with those beans as they start cooking. Then you're going to add 6 cloves of garlic. You're going to dice 2 onions and add. I'm using my food processor today because I got so tired of onions stinging my eyes. But sometimes I chop them by hand and sometimes I do them in the food processor. It works pretty well in the food processor, so that's what I'm doing today. I did more than 2 onions, so I'm not adding them all, but add 2 onions worth of onions to your soup, and also 2 bell peppers. These are those freeze-dried bell peppers again. I typically have freeze-dried onions. Freeze-dried onions and freeze-dried bell peppers are probably my absolute favorite things to have on hand in the kitchen, freeze-dried wise, because it's so convenient to just open the jar and dump them in. So then you want to add 3 bay leaves and a ham hock, a smoked ham hock. You can get them at pretty much all grocery stores have them. If you don't add it, it won't be the end of the world, but it does really give them a nice flavor, that smoked ham hock flavor. And then I add a pound of sausage. Again, this is optional. You don't have to add it. You got plenty of protein from your beans, but I love the sausage in there. Everybody loves the sausage. It really just, I don't know, I guess it elevates it. It's better. It makes it better. You don't have to have the sausage, but it definitely makes it better. And Eric likes the sausage in big, huge chunks, so I do always put some in there for him in those bigger chunks instead of sliced. But it's much easier for the kids to eat it with it sliced. Add a tablespoon of parsley and 2 teaspoons of chili powder, 1 can of diced tomatoes with the juice, get it all stirred up, and then just put the lid on and let it cook. Beans do have to cook quite a while, especially if you're starting from dried beans. I don't ever really pay attention to the time. I would say probably a couple of hours. After your beans are cooked, you're going to add in 1 cup of uncooked quinoa. Definitely always rinse your quinoa before. It can be bitter if you don't rinse it. They say until the water comes clear, till the water runs clear under it, but I just rinse it really nice and well in the little strainer colander thing there. You can cook your quinoa and add it to the soup if you want to do it that way, but it's so easy just to put the uncooked quinoa in there with a little extra water and let it cook in the pot. Stir that quinoa in and then put your lid on and let it cook. It doesn't take super long to cook, you know, probably 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Add in a bunch of kale, 1 bunch, not a bunch, 1 bunch of kale. I didn't do the entire bunch this time. I did about 3/4 of it and my pot was just getting so full. So half to 1 whole bunch, however much you prefer in your soup. And then you're going to want to taste it to see if you need to adjust your seasonings any. Add more salt, add more Tony's, onion powder, garlic powder, however you like to season it. But you definitely want to taste it and see if you need to add any extra seasonings. And it's delicious already. So then just add your lid and let that kale cook down a little bit. And once the quinoa cooks, you may need to add more liquid. As you can tell, it really soaked up the liquid here. So I will add some water. I ended up adding about 3 cups of water just to get it to the soupiness that our family prefers. So add water if you need to. If you want to add water at the beginning, you can when you add your quinoa, but I prefer to add it afterwards so that I don't end up with like a really watery, runny soup. We prefer a thick, hearty soup. So after my quinoa cooks, unless you don't want to burn it. So if your soup's already really dry, you can add the water before, but you can add it slowly, stir it around to where you get it to your preferred consistency. And if you make any major changes, like adding 3 cups of water to your soup, you definitely want to taste it and make sure that you don't need to adjust your seasonings. Again, it's kind of just keep tasting it throughout cooking because everything you do is going to change it. Mine was actually a little bit more seasoned, so I didn't need adding. So I hope you enjoyed the cook along with me style video and maybe it gave you a new recipe or 2 to try. Definitely don't forget to go check out my mom's videos, her video about her soups. I'll link it below. I know one of the ones she's definitely doing is a vegetable soup recipe, vegetable beef soup. It is one that I ate growing up. She taught me how to make it. It's the easiest soup. You really can't mess it up, and it's always delicious. So definitely be sure and do that. Let me know in the comments, are you gonna try one of the soups? Do any of them sound good or look good to you? But what is your favorite soup? I'm always looking for new soup recipes to try because we love doing soup so much. So let me know if you have a favorite that is not one that either her or I made. Thanks for joining, and I'll see you next time. Bye.